Good morning, everyone. I'm Ray Pucci. I'm president of the Delaware County Chamber of Commerce. And welcome to Chamber Connects. We're recording this morning's program, and we'll post it a little bit later on this morning for viewing on our Chamber's YouTube channel. In just a few minutes, we'll be connecting with State Senator Mike Martucci. If you have questions for the senator, please post them over in the chat box. But before I introduce the senator, before I introduce Mike to you, let me update you a little bit on some of the things that the chamber has been doing recently. As many of you know, we've been leading an effort to develop a public transit option here in Delaware County. And I'm very pleased to tell you that we have our launch meeting, not lunch, launch meeting tomorrow morning with our contractor and some members of that steering committee and what they're going to be doing over the next few months is creating a service and operation plan. And of course, I'm going to share some of those details with you as soon as we know them. Also, right now is the time to nominate a business colleague or even yourself for a Delaware County Business Award. Categories include Business of the Year, New Business of the Year, Business Connector, Business Advocate, and perhaps others. So send us the story, send us your story, send us your friend's story, and we'll be announcing those award recipients early next month. Finally, our next breakfast is our next business and breakfast is on Friday, August 19th, of course, at the Hampden Inn, starting at 8:30 in the morning. Dr. David Brower, who is the dean of the Hospitality and Business School at SUNY Delhi, will speak about how to motivate and inspire Gen Z workers. So that's going to be a fascinating conversation, and I hope that you can be part of that by joining us there for breakfast on August 19th. The Delaware County Chamber, just as a reminder to y'all, the Delaware County Chamber of Commerce is a private, non-governmental, not-for-profit membership organization. Our mission is really centered on three ideas: advocate, connect, grow. And in that, we're the unified voice for the business community here in Delaware County. And we relay your message to our elected officials and policymakers in Washington, Albany, and even in Delhi. We help our members and other business owners connect with area resources. We offer exclusive discount services, and more importantly, we help them connect with each other to increase their profitability. Finally, we help our members grow their capacities by offering targeted business skill training and leadership development. So I encourage you, I think everyone on the call right now is a member, but if you have a business colleague who is not a member of the Delaware County Chamber, ask them to join, encourage them to join. The Chamber is really your source for assistance, your single source for assistance, ideas, inspiration, and most of all, the facts. You know, membership, we have lots of benefit for membership, and membership only starts at $99 a year. So information about membership, Chamber news, registration for events, you already know the address. It's delawarecounty.org. Our Chamber Connects series focuses on public policy issues that are affecting our members. Today, we're going to take a look at New York issues, including what issues may still be pending at the state legislature. And I'm pleased to introduce to you a friend of mine, a friend of the Chamber, and a friend to Delaware County to you this morning as our featured speaker. Mike Martucci is serving his first term as the senator for the 42nd New York State Senate District. And that comprises all of Sullivan, parts of Orange, parts of Ulster, and parts of Delaware counties. He has been named the ranking member of the Senate Committee on Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities, and also Small Business, the Commerce and Economic Development Committee. Mike grew up in the town of Middle St. and is a lifelong resident of Orange County. At the age of 22, Senator Martucci is just a baby. At the age of 22, Mike took his life savings and opened a school bus business called Quality Bus Service. With a startup business loan and his grandmother as his first employee, Mike began driving a school bus and providing service to the Greenwood Lake Union Free School District down in Orange County. Through hard work, great risk, and of course, good fortune, Mike grew the Quality Bus Service to over 550 employees with more than 350 school buses that provided critical services to thousands of local school children every single day. Mike's also a family farmer, and he's a steward of our environment and understands the importance of preserving open space for future generations. Mike and his wife, Erin, who's a school counselor, are raising their 3 children. And Mike, I have to tell you, there's no denying parentage in those 3 kids. Mike Jr., daughters Elizabeth and Catherine, down in New Hampton. Mike obtained his Master of Business Administration and his Bachelor of Science at Marist College. Prior to Marist College, Mike graduated with honors from Orange County Community College. Senator Martucci, welcome to Chamber Connects, and thanks for joining me this morning.
Thanks, Ray. It's always great to be here and be with everyone at the Chamber, whether it's in person or virtually. It's always so great to see you and connect with you and your members. So thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. Mike, you're completing your first term as state senator, and you recently announced that you're not going to seek re-election. So with maybe that's a little freeing opportunity for you. What observations and reflections do you have about those past nearly 2 years in office?
So Ray, the answer is yeah, it's always a bit freeing when you're not back on the ballot, right? But I think that, what I'll start off by sharing with you and your members is that, and thank you for the bio, you'll see, really, I consider myself one of you in a way bigger fashion than I consider myself a politician here in Albany, right? When I say that, what I mean is, I come from a small business background, having started a business, understanding firsthand exactly what it's like to employ people in the state of New York, to deal with our burdensome regulations here, which can make doing business even more difficult. The importance of small businesses to band together, to be focused, to be resilient, especially in times like we're still emerging right now from COVID, and certainly entering a pretty difficult economic time, not only for our state and our region, but also for our country. And, I would tell you that, first and foremost, unfortunately, there are not enough people who think like the people on this Zoom in elected office, whether it's in Albany or Washington, D.C. I mean, my colleagues, most of them, unfortunately, have a lot of experience signing the backs of checks, but not a whole lot of experience signing the front of checks. And that's really very different. Those are 2 very different activities. And I think that not only is it difficult for someone to understand, but in many ways, very impossible to understand the struggles of running a business here unless you've been there firsthand. And, I had the pleasure of being a small business owner in this state and literally riding on the front seat of the roller coaster with my hands in the air screaming, right, through the ups and downs of what it's like to own a business, what it's like to employ people, what it's like to compete for public contracts, what it's like to deal with burdensome regulations and some of our state agencies that can make your life so difficult and sometimes impossible. Relying on resources like the Chamber of Commerce here in Orange County, where my business was located, and leaning on others to make sure that my business was successful. And my goal was to bring that experience with me to the state legislature so that, sometimes what happens in the Capitol building isn't reality. Unfortunately, more times than not, it's not reality. So I think that it's really important that now and moving into the future, we've got strong voices here that understand what it's about to be on the ground and in the trenches. Because the small businesses, your membership, they're the backbone of the economy, not only in Delaware County, but around our entire state. And unfortunately, it's more uncommon than it should be that we get legislators who have that experience firsthand.
Mike, you've been the ranking member of the Senate Economic Development Committee. Certainly, that's been a bit of a roller coaster over the last year plus. What accomplishments can you point to over that almost 2 years, and what priorities do you see still remain to be done with that committee?
Absolutely. So, I mean, look, when I started on the committee, really the first goal was how do we help shepherd businesses out of COVID, right? Because we were in the middle of COVID. I took office in January of 2021. We were coming off of the heels of extensive shutdowns. Businesses were restarting at that time. So really, a lot of what we were focused on wasn't the 5-year plan or the 3-year plan or the 10-year plan. It was the 2-month plan, the 4-week plan. And really, Ray, the first thing that I was focused on being was a strong voice for business reopening. I believe that shutdowns lasted way too long in this state. I believe that small businesses, whether we're talking about restaurants or hair salons or others, were carrying a disproportionate share of the burden with respect to the shutdown. I mean, the bottom line is we had a state government that told businesses, you have to lock your doors, you have to shutter your businesses. And then, from my perspective, even when the science was pointing to the fact that those businesses could reopen, and we had business owners who were willing to make investments to open safely, to open with accommodations like restricted capacities, et cetera, we had a state that was lagging behind. So the first thing that I really was focused on being was a loud voice, literally trying to stand on the governor's desk and scream and yell and say, open businesses, because it was time. And there was a lot of discussion about what government should be doing for business. And my argument the whole time was the best thing we can do is let businesses open, right? That was the most simple and direct thing that we could do. So really, that took up a lot of time and a lot of effort, which it shouldn't have, because opening was a simple, logical thing that we should have been doing at that time. Thankfully, we have moved a bit away from that. And now I think really what we need to be focused on, and what I'm spending my last 5 months or so focusing on, is how do we take a look at economic development in this state and really change it from what it was in the prior administration. I would argue under Governor Cuomo that economic development in this state became a very top-down process where organizations like ESDC and others were getting tons and tons of money, piles of money, billions of dollars, and projects were being directed from Albany to particular places in this state that I believe were for political reasons. I don't believe were necessarily in the best interests of the communities that they were venued in. And I think that ultimately, where we need to head from a state economic development standpoint is to empower local communities, local regions to be identifying projects that fit them best, and then utilizing resources to attract and retain those products there. Those businesses there. Because at the end of the day, no one knows what Delaware County needs more than you and your membership. You should be identifying the businesses that we should be attracting to the region. You should be bringing those businesses to the table, whether it's through the regional economic development councils or other groups, rather than having Albany politicians decide, well, this is what Delaware County needs to do, or this is what any county around our state needs to do. So I think that for me, besides getting past the immediate focus to reopen businesses so that businesses had the ability to get back on their feet, the second piece now really is, as we look forward toward economic development, how do we make it local? How do we make it regional? How do we give communities the most say in what's happening? And how do we make it not this top-down process that has absolutely failed our state to this point? Lastly, and finally, the thing that I'll say is I'm a big fan of getting government out of the way of business. In my business, in the school bus business, I worked with several state agencies, whether it was DOT or DMV or the state education department and others. And so many times what I knew was that if government just got out of the way, we could be more successful. So certainly I advocate for taking a look at duplicate, non-necessary, non-value added regulation. And again, simply how we just make life easier for our business owners, because it's something that goes a long way and allows your membership to be laser focused on their mission rather than all this other stuff that just takes up so much time and energy.
Mike, there's just a couple things I want to follow up on what you just said. And for those who are joining us, I want to remind you that if you have questions that you'd like to ask the senator, please post them over in the chat area. Two things. One legislation that came out of this last session created tax credits, the ability for tax credits for those small businesses to not fully compensate, not fully reimburse, but to help manage the costs of some of those mandated supplies, improvements, infrastructure that was needed in order for them to be permitted to reopen. So on behalf of the members, thank you for the role that you had in that. But I want to talk about that idea of changing the way economic development is done in New York State. And your point, I think, is absolutely spot on, that it was, most recently in this last session, we heard a lot about the Buffalo, the Buffalo Bills Stadium, and reminded people of the Buffalo Billions from a few years ago when Cuomo was governor. And we always seem to be chasing that next sexy project, and instead of really instead of having that realization that economic development in some ways is just the top of this pyramid that really starts with community development and organizational development, and it's about employment, but it's about making sure that the communities are ready for those dollars. Is that kind of the direction that you're hoping to push things over these last 5 months?
The answer to your question is absolutely, Ray. I mean, again, what you call out, whether it's the Buffalo Billions, whether it's the stadium deal, whether it's SUNY Polytech, which was another great example of a project like this. These projects are all selected for political reasons, right? And those are all the wrong reasons to do economic development or focus economic development dollars. And to your point, when you talk about community development, organizational development, what are some of the things that are important in Delaware County? Well, the first is infrastructure. If businesses are going to locate in Delaware County in identified corridors, you need to have infrastructure to support those businesses, whether it's building out water and sewer utilities is a great example. Now, those projects aren't sexy projects, as you call out. There's nothing exciting about saying that, we're going to go invest a tremendous amount of money in this water and sewer infrastructure project that literally gets buried underground that no one can see, right? No, what people that are running for office want to do is build a gigantic stadium, right? That people can see. They can go there, they can touch it, they can experience good memories there. That's where the focus has been. And the reality is, when the rubber hits the road, when we talk about what needs to happen to actually support businesses, to sustain growth, to create jobs, good paying jobs, jobs that will attract and retain people in the region, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about addressing a housing crisis that's happening in the region, not just in your county, but the entire region. It's not so exciting to talk about or address that crisis. I talked about water and sewer infrastructure, not so exciting to address that crisis. And equally as important, finally, address what has been kicked down the can, the can's been kicked down the road by this state in a long time, but you've been a strong advocate for, which is addressing land acquisition in the region and in the county. Because unless we do those things, the future is very uncertain, right? But those things are not things that politicians who are looking to be reelected or running for reelection find themselves talking a whole lot about. Unfortunately, as you call out, it's these bigger, sexier projects. And at the end of the day, look, at the ROI is there to prove that these are nothing but political projects, because there's billions and billions of dollars that have been spent with very little created in return. And in fact, so many of these projects The only thing that came out of them were indictments and jail sentences, right? So I mean, if that in of itself is not a clue enough to know that this process isn't working, then I don't know what is. So again, I'm a huge advocate of saying regional councils need to be strengthened, and regional councils need to be the driving force behind what projects or where project dollars go. Because if politicians are behind it, we've got big trouble.
Mike, you talk about your business experience, and this has been your first elected office. How has your private business experience, your work in the private sector, how has that all informed your work as state senator over the last year and a half?
So Ray, the first thing I would tell you is I think what it definitely does is it's a constant reminder to me to be connected to reality, because what happens in the Capitol is not reality. It sort of is like this alternate universe where oftentimes we find people talking about policy as if it's abstract and it doesn't impact people. So really, one of my greatest tools during the time that I've served in the Senate has been my cell phone and the list of people in it. So when we have something before us, a policy issue, a bill, it has been a great resource to me to call you or text you and say, Ray, what about this? Like, how does this impact someone that you represent? And all day long in the legislature, we take up issues on topics that I know very little or nothing about, and I believe many of my colleagues know very little about. Sometimes we take up an issue, for example, that affects or impacts funeral homes. And I've never worked in a funeral home. I don't know anything about the business, but to be able to text you or call you and say, Ray, do you have a member who I can talk to? Can you connect me with somebody? Because I don't understand what I'm looking at here. I think that that's been the most important, is that I try always to find myself not talking to a lobbyist or an interest group about topics exclusively, but rather going out and finding somebody who this impacts. I think back to my time in the school bus business and can remember where there was new regulation or new law, and reading it and saying to myself, oh, like the person who did this or the motivation behind this is totally misguided. Because oftentimes, again, we're taking actions that don't solve problems, that make your life more difficult. So for me, I've always sort of looked at legislation as saying, when we take up an issue, how do I find the person who this is going to impact on the ground level, the person whose feet are touching the ground? How do we find that person? How do we have a conversation with them? Because I think that's really where so many of our policies are misguided with respect, especially to small businesses, that legislators, my colleagues who sit in the chamber with me, may not have ill intentions, but just simply don't understand how what they're doing impacts your membership and by extension impacts the economy of our state and the employers that drive that economy.
Mike, you raise a really interesting point in that legislators act or react based on pressure points, advocacy groups, and certainly business has their own advocacy groups, including us. But you raise an interesting point that they're putting in rules that affect folks that they don't consult often, that they really don't dive into the minutia. They have an issue. Okay, we've solved that. We've got that check mark. We're moving on to the next issue, and that's one of the things that I've always appreciated in our conversations, is that you seek that information, but you dive into the details. And a few minutes ago, you referenced the land acquisition program, and that's billed as, well, we all want clean water, and to do that we need to do this. Well, that's and that's great if you're putting it on a poster, but when you're living it and you're understanding what the implications are, it's quite a different situation on the ground or in the business or whatever it might be that you're actually being impacted. Something like that, though, is that type of immediate response is probably not going to change in Albany, though, is it?
No, Ray, because at the end of the day, the reality remains that so much policy is driven by politics. And what drives politics? Well, it's the news of the day, right? Whatever is sort of first and foremost and upfront in the news drives so much policy. We've seen that over the past several months with some of, I'll call two of like sort of the nation's largest hot button issues. Whether it's the most recent abortion decision heard by the Supreme Court, whether it's the gun laws that have been heard by the Supreme Court, two great examples of national issues that drive immediate response in state policy. So number one, to your point, and I'm not speaking specifically to these two things, but I'm sort of now speaking more broadly to any legislation. To your point, a lot of times the politics of the day dictates what's on the top of the, on the top of the stack, so to speak. I think that is concerning as a general statement, because you're right. Sometimes you get legislation that I would argue is not ready for prime time, but rather gets pulled out of the bottom of the stack and stuck at the top. And we say, we're addressing this today, right now, because it's front page in the news. And instead of really spending time to do it right, it gets done quickly. And I can point to several pieces of legislation just in my term that were done fast and not done right. And who pays the price for that? Well, the answer is the people of this state pay the price. Our businesses pay the price. So I think that that is important. I'll speak to the land acquisition for a minute and use that as another great example of saying how, unfortunately, I think politics is driving policy, which is not in the best interest of the people who live in Delaware County. Look, at the end of the day, there are organizations who are interested in seeing land preservation take place. I understand why. I'm a fan of land preservation. I think it needs to be part of a master plan with respect to build out throughout our entire state. But there are groups in this state that are using New York City's land acquisition program, from my perspective, as a pinch point to acquire more land and preserve more land. What's happening, obviously, is it's hamstringing Delaware County's opportunities with respect to infrastructure build out, things like broadband and getting those utilities we were just talking about to the places where they need to be. It's limiting the ability of your communities to find approved building sites and economic development sites and locations. So there's just another example of where I think so many of my colleagues in the room look at the top line of the issue and say, well, land preservation, that's a great idea. Clean water, that's something we can all agree on. Sure. We absolutely have to move forward with a plan, rather than looking at the impact and the science and the data, which you've been a leader on, to say, look, acquiring more land doesn't make cleaner water for us anymore. We've hit a critical point. Look, acquiring more land isn't something that's necessary to preserve the health and safety of people, our neighbors in New York City. That's not important anymore. But again, here I think is just another example of where the politics are driving the decision rather than the data and the science driving the policy. Because if it was driven by data and science, we'd be using the data and science that you're showing us and talking about that tells us this land acquisition program has been successful with respect to protecting clean water. It's not necessary to grow it beyond where we've grown it. In fact, we've grown it past that critical point. And we're here to be partners with our neighbors in New York City to make sure that they can continue to receive clean water and we can have a pathway forward in our region. So I would tell you that that I think that is just another example, a local example of where sort of this top line issue of land preservation becomes the buzzword, clean water becomes the buzzword, and nobody really wants to talk about the meat and potatoes of it to craft a good deal. So certainly I look forward to spending my last 5 months working with you in county planning and others to do the best we can to plate an important conversation that whoever my successor is in your region will be able to carry forward in a good way, because it is one of the most important economic development pieces that exists for you right now.
You're absolutely correct. We have a question from one of our participants. I'm a small business owner in the adult use, the adult use cannabis industry, recently awarded licensee in this new New York State market. As you know, myself and other hemp farmers are operating in an environment where regulations have not yet been established. And to your point, it often seems as though the parties creating the regulations have an amazing social agendas, but don't know much about the actual workings of this industry. How can she, how can we all best advocate for our needs and our agendas in this highly regulated yet tenuous environment while actively building the business? My concern is that the politics are most definitely driving the policies. I wonder if we need to enlist the assistance of a lobbyist, but would hope that there are better ways to have a seat at the table as experts, as they really are, in the industry with a personal investment in this community and environment. What a great question.
Yeah, it is an outstanding question. First of all, I think spot on in the observation, no question about it. What I would tell you in my experience, representing a district where there are several organizations, whether they're interested in the distribution, the commercial grow side, and others, what I have found is that many are currently represented professionally by either counsel, lobbyists, a combination of both. But what I would tell you is that even folks that are professionally represented are sharing the same sort of uncertainty. Certainly the Cannabis Control Board, as you know, was convened.
Yeah.
And, was convened a bit late, not by any fault of that board itself, but it did take several months from the time that MRT was passed all the way up to when that board sort of came together. And they have been diligently working, holding hearings and crafting legislation. Certainly to your point, with respect to some of the guardrails, so to speak, of the legislation that put around the crafting of those regulations. Some of them did involve social justice components, for example. So some of that regulation is guided and informed by those components, which are part of regulation. But I would tell you that we are all, not just you, but so many of us are eagerly awaiting the release of these regulations. If you rewind back to the end of last year, when individual communities had to either opt in or opt out of distribution,
retail sales,
rather. I was getting calls, tons of calls from communities, towns, local leaders who were saying, Mike, show us the regulations so we can decide if we want to opt in or opt out. And we said, well, we have bad news. We don't have regulation we can show you right now. And again, no fault of the boards, because again, they were convened a bit late. But I think that led to an inordinate number of opt-outs because absent of regulation, many local leaders were looking at the ability to opt out and said, well, you know what, we should opt out for now until we see what the regulation says, and then we can opt in at a later point. I think that only creates further delays for folks like you that are looking to see this take off. So there have been several, from my perspective, systemic failures of government to really get this off the ground in a good way and an organized way. And, now is the time for us to make up ground. But what I would tell you is, just to simply answer your question, while we eagerly await the Cannabis Control Board to continue and come to an expeditious end to their work, I think that a couple options exist for you. Certainly, you're in the right place here, this venue. Local chambers have been spending so much time and energy with elected officials like me and other regulators, because this is a huge opportunity for our region, whether it's Delaware County, for me, Sullivan County, Ulster, or Orange. I've got projects going on in every one of those counties, which is super exciting. So certainly your organized advocacy with groups like the Chamber is important. And secondly, as we go a little further down the road, to be entirely honest, because a lot of this is not navigated, certainly consideration should be paid to hiring, whether it's a professional lobbyist or an attorney, to help guide you and perhaps even others through this process could make sense. Smaller producers might want to bind together in a small co-op and sort of get somebody, to kind of organize their regional efforts, because it will be an increasing, challenge, because certainly once the final regs are released across the board, I think that there is going to be sort of a sprint to the finish line. So it's so important, I think, that you position yourself as far forward as you possibly can when that time comes. And lastly and finally, I suspect that a lot of this will happen when I'm out of office, but please use whoever your elected officials are as a resource to you and for you. Certainly that professional representation can be expensive. And if it's something that doesn't fit in your budget, know that you've got a great advocate in Ray. I will always be here to be helpful as soon as that information emerges. And lastly and finally, if I can be a voice to the regulators, I'm here to do that for you too. So please reach out to me and your other elected officials. Send us an email. I'm sure Ray can get our information out if you don't have it already. But please send us an email and say, hey, this is something we'd like to see included. This is a provision that's important because we're always talking with agencies and with regulators, and we'll be happy to use our microphone to make sure that they hear you. Because I think that, again, we need to be taking feedback from the folks that are on the ground, and frankly, the folks who have the most skin in the game. That's you. You've got a ton of skin in this game. And we want to make sure that at the end of the day, whatever's crafted creates an environment for you where you can be successful. And I think these delays have made it more difficult for you. And I apologize for those. Certainly, I would like to have seen this process work much more expeditiously. But again, I think that those are all options, smart angles to take. But you are wise taking your weight and shifting it to your toes, because once this goes, you're gonna want your weight forward, and you're gonna want to be ready to move. So I applaud you for being ready and for being on the edge of an emerging market that I think is going to be very, very important for the state of New York. I do want to be clear, sort of to the folks that are here on the call too, with respect to this issue. I am all in on the economic benefits of what this means, not only for our region, but for our state. I had concerns about the law as it was crafted, specifically with respect to one issue, which was traffic safety, which I would like to see this legislature in future sessions address in a smart way. But absent of that, I think that this is a really nice opportunity for our farmers, who really need a lifeline now more than ever, because so many of our streams of revenue with respect to farming, certainly dairy being the prime example, have all but literally and figuratively dried up in our region. So this is a great opportunity for us to preserve the agricultural identity of the region in a new way that allows folks to utilize their land and their property and be successful. So for those that are listening or watching this at a later point, if I could be helpful to you, please reach out.
And I should point out that our September Chamber Connects program, I expect that former State Senator Jen Metzger, who's a member of that State Cannabis Control Board, is going to be our featured speaker. And that's going to be a really fascinating conversation, I'm sure. Mike, let's keep with that theme of politics and policies. And there's probably no better example of Albany politics this past year than the redistricting process. You talked before about being in business, being an entrepreneur is something of being on a roller coaster in the front seat where the arm's up in the air. And I think that's about it, the most perfect analogy I can think of. But this redistricting process really has been something of a roller coaster ride, at least over the last few months. Your district changed dramatically since January. And unfortunately, and I'm speaking personally, unfortunately, that ultimately led to your decision not to seek re-election. What do you think? Is the redistricting process over at this point? Or can we expect some more shifts, especially on the assembly side in 2023?
Yeah, so I'll start with this, Ray. Unfortunately, the redistricting process, not only here in the state of New York, but you've seen national stories about this, is a wickedly partisan process, period, right? Regardless of which party is in control. In states like New York, where the Democratic Party is in control, they control redistricting. In other states where the Republican Party is in control, that party controls redistricting. And essentially, like I said, I can't describe it other than a wickedly political process whereby whichever party is in control utilizes their majority, their legislative majority, and their executive power to essentially step on, stomp, and drive into the ground the other party to the best of their ability, right? And ultimately, what that is bad for democracy, right? Because, I speak as a member who's elected to a district that has been represented by a Democrat and a Republican in the most recent 2 election cycles. Both former Senator Metzger and I won this district by very small margins. It's a highly competitive district. And I truly believe that if districts were constructed like the current 42nd district, highly competitive, those districts were constructed like that, not only around our state, but around our country, we'd have people that were much more engaged in the political process, people who felt like their votes mattered, people who knew that in an election that would be decided by a couple hundred or 1,000 votes, that it meant something to get in the car and go to the polls and cast your vote. But unfortunately, when politicians get the pen and they get to decide how things happen, what you get are highly partisan districts. And what you get are disengaged citizens and voters who say, what does it matter? You know, the outcome of this election is prescribed before a single person goes to the ballot box because of the way that politicians have constructed the process. So what I would tell you is New York's process was awful. It was terrible to live through. I never want to do it again, ever, admittedly. And I think that people were just sick and tired of hearing of it. I mean, here in this state, you know, redistricting first went to an independent commission that was that had its flaws. Then that independent commission failed at meeting its mission. So it went to a highly partisan state legislative process. Then out of that process came litigation. That found its way all the way to our state's highest court. The state's highest court had determined that the process was flawed, which resulted in the court redrawing lines. You know, in that process, what I would tell you is that the current district that I represent was basically cut directly, you know, cut right in half and completely dismantled. You know, my individual story sort of isn't the takeaway from this, you know, in that I think the most important thing that we look at moving forward with respect to representation is just that I urge people, be involved and be engaged in elections. You know, you've got a special election coming up on August 23rd in less than a month for a member of Congress. You know, your members should be engaged in that because that election is gonna have not only implications in your region and our state, but national implications. And as we move forward to November, just my advice is be engaged. You all are very educated here. You feature candidates on your forum. Please learn about these candidates, learn how these candidates not only look at policy, but sort of how you think they're going to impact your businesses and your families. It is so critical. To your point, the redistricting process is final and irrevocable for both Congress and state Senate. However, in a late decision, it was determined that the assembly districts that are being run on this year will indeed be redone by the court, much in the same fashion that the state Senate and the congressional districts were redone. So what's kind of crazy is that the new Senate districts and congressional districts will begin this November, that folks will be running in to take effect January 1st, right? So they'll be running in the districts for the November election. They'll be occupying those districts January 1st. And then the assembly will happen 2 years after. So what I would say is stay tuned because there will be a lot of shakeups on that side that potentially could impact your region. I know Delaware County has several assembly members that kind of come into the county. You're sort of the center of a star with respect to assembly districts. One of the priorities that we saw of the court in its redistricting process was the ability to keep counties whole when possible. And I think what that means for you is that it's highly likely, though I have no direct knowledge of this, but it's highly likely that just like you're ending up with one congressional representative and one state Senate representative, whoever those folks might be, you will also likely end up with fewer assembly representatives, maybe one, in fact, in that process, which I think does have inherent benefits in that it makes your life easier, Ray, certainly with respect to who you're interfacing with, but also with respect to the people that call the county home. I mean, Delaware County is a county of less than 50,000 people. And I think so many folks don't even know who their representatives are because the county is cut up into all these little pieces. So you have to find your way online and Google who represents me, right? Which is difficult. So I think that there is an inherent benefit in having a single representative in those places. Namely, too, because you share so many priorities. I mean, there are shared priorities between Sydney and Delhi. Hampton and Masonville are similar towns, right? So it doesn't make sense that the dividing line runs between them in many cases. So I think that the redistricting process certainly had its flaws and its warts. I got to see them firsthand. And what I sincerely hope is that my successor and the successors in the legislature will spend the next 10 years. They have a long time, right? So they should get this right. Figure out a way to do this process right. Don't subject the people of the state of New York to this again in 10 years from now. Don't subject folks to a highly partisan process. Spend the next decade, get it right, figure out how we get equal representation without doing it in a wickedly partisan way. We're better than this. It can be done.
Well, Mike, back in 2014, we thought we did have that process in place, but then that process got sidestepped and ignored.
You're absolutely right, Ray. And I would tell you that, the second thing that I would mention is the architects of this policy in 2014 may have had the best intentions at heart, but clearly didn't create a waterproof system here with respect to how that commission was designed to operate. And again, I'll be perfectly clear. The problem is that the politicians had control over that process.
Yeah.
And the politicians in office are not willing to give up complete control of the redistricting process to others. That's ultimately what's necessary to make this process nonpartisan, is to take the fingerprints of elected officials off of it. Because again, if what we're here really for is democracy, if what we're here really for is for the good of the state and the good of the citizens of the state, what we have to do is not put the interests of the jobs of politicians and their incumbency before all that other stuff. And like I said, my colleagues and my future colleagues will have a huge job ahead of them with respect to making this happen. But it's a challenge that I believe they have no choice but to step up to. And if they don't, I hope that there are others here on the call that are motivated to hold them accountable, because they owe it to you. And if they don't, do what I did, run for office and hold them accountable, because you can and you should.
Yeah, you mentioned that we're kind of, split in all different directions. Currently, we have 3 state senators representing parts of Delaware County and 3 different assembly representatives. And you're right, we just make sure that we touch everybody. And you mentioned the special election coming up on the 23rd. And you're right, we always make it a point to reach out to those candidates. Kind of just a heads up for everyone who's on the call. And Mike, I know this would be of interest to you as well. We're working with our friends at the Sullivan County Chamber. We're going to be hosting a candidate forum. We haven't set a date yet. We're still negotiating with both of the campaigns for Ryan and Molinaro to have a candidate forum, likely around Roscoe, sometime during early August. So stay tuned for.
Yeah, that's great, Ray. And what I will say is thank you to you and to Jamie at the Sullivan Chamber for doing things like that, because certainly, especially in a special election like this, most folks don't even know there's an election happening. They don't even know that on August 23rd, you're supposed to go to the polls. So the more you get the word out, certainly the better, because obviously in this particular case, this election has a huge impact, not only regionally and statewide, but also national implications as we march solidly toward November. So thanks for your role in that and creating that forum, not only for your members, but for the wider public.
Thank you. Mike, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit, at least, about the state budget. It's a few months old now. That process this year seemed a little bit more complicated. What wasn't this year in Albany, it seems like. But it was more complicated than expected. There were a lot more non-fiscal issues loaded in the budget than typical. I'm curious, what's your general impression of the budget that was passed?
Well, so Ray, what I'll start by saying is this: New York State taxes, borrows, and spends too much money, period. Right? That's a going in starting point for what I'm about to tell you with respect to this budget, because I will use this just as an example. This year we passed a budget that's nearly $220 billion. When I started in the state Senate, which was 2021, right? 2 budgets ago, the budget was $40 billion less, nearly $40 billion less than the one we just passed. So I want you to really sit and think about that for a minute, right? We had a $180 billion budget-ish. That budget works its way all the way to a number 216 billion, right? But here's the point, right? The point is this state's spending has way outpaced inflation, even with inflation at record rates right now. This state's spending has way outpaced inflation. From my perspective, has been a contributor to the inflationary issues that we're dealing with right now. And it's one of the reasons why I largely don't support the budget. So for the viewers, the budget is made up of 10 bills. It's not one bill, it's actually 10 component bills that come together for the budget. Typically, I support components of it. When I say that, what I mean is typically two out of the 10 bills are things that I can look at and say, those make sense, whether they send resources to the district that I represent or the region, fund important state operations. But largely, what you see in the other bills is pork barrel spending, a lot of patronage in those provisions. And like you said, a lot of policy in the budget that really doesn't belong there. It's never belonged there. The most famous now piece of policy that's found its way into a state budget is bail reform, which we spend a lot of time talking about. What is a public safety issue like bail reform doing in a fiscal bill like the budget? Well, the answer is it didn't belong there in the first place. It should have never been there. So to your point, what I would say is, I had the opportunity to work on one budget under former Governor Cuomo, one opportunity to work under a budget under now Governor Hochul, our new governor. And what I would tell you is certainly the styles are a bit different with respect to how they approach the process. But what I would say as a general statement is that, it's long past due that there's really a top to bottom analysis done on the state budget with respect to how much money we're spending, with respect to where there is waste and fraud and abuse. Ray, there's a ton of it. And for whatever reason, what I've come to realize as a member of this legislature is that the powers that be, the majorities, the legislative leaders, the executive in many cases, doesn't have a willingness to really address those issues. So instead, what you get is out of control spending, from my perspective, and spending that's not sustainable. What I will tell you is that budget that I just described to you has been offset by my entire term in office, the last 2 years, by federal funds, federal ARPA funds, and other monies that are not here next year. So one of the great challenges of whoever replaces me in this seat is going to be figuring out what combination of revenue raisers and cuts are necessary to close the gap. And what I will tell you is that revenue raisers are nice words, Albany language for new taxes, right? And we can't afford that, right? Not at a time like this, not when families are struggling to survive, not when your grocery bill and your gas bill is skyrocketed, not when many of the employees who come to work at our businesses every day are literally one flat tire away from being bankrupt, right? They get a flat tire, there's not $100 in the bank account to put a new tire on the car so they can keep coming to work. This is how fragile the situation is. And this state has spent money like it's printing it, like it's the federal government, and it is not. So I think that next year, unfortunately, economic situation is going to force policymakers to be making difficult decisions about where cuts need to be made. And unfortunately, there will be conversations about revenue raisers. And again, I can't support new taxes for New Yorkers. I can't see how it makes sense for families, working families right now. It can't make sense for businesses. It's not where we should be headed. What we should have been doing, Ray, this whole time are doing things like addressing an $8+ billion state unemployment insurance liability that is hanging over our heads. Yep. And you know what? When I talk about this in the room, going back to sexy political issues, my colleagues don't want to talk about it. They say, well, that's money that was loaned to us by the federal government. We'll worry about that later. Give me a break, right? We've got an $8 billion liability hanging over our heads that are going to be passed right along to your membership, right along to our state's employers in special assessments and unemployment increases. We can't afford this. So rather than spending money on, for example, giving $1 billion to billionaires in Buffalo to build a stadium for a league that's worth billions more, we should have been going and helping our small businesses by reducing and eliminating this huge unemployment liability that hangs over their head. That would have been a better use of money. right? But instead, going back to politics driving policy, what we end up with is a really, really bad deal for the taxpayers of the state of New York. You can watch the video. I was standing on the Senate floor probably at about 2 or 3 in the morning when we were debating the $1 billion plus of money that was going, or nearly the $1 billion of money rather, that was going to the Buffalo Bills. And I'm sure I was awake and the Senate sponsor of the bill was awake, but nobody else was. And that's what people are so sick of about politics, is that, let me tell you how long the public really knew about this stadium deal. This stadium deal was in the news scuttlebutt for weeks and weeks. Everyone knew it was coming. I knew it was coming. You knew it was coming. Everyone watching knew it was coming. We all suspected it was going to be a bad deal, but literally in the dark of the night, under the cover of darkness, a bill was printed. It sees the light of day for several hours, only several hours, to find out that we're spending $850 million, again, almost $1 billion on a project like this. So for folks to wake up in the morning and find out this is the way the state has spent your tax dollars really is an insult. It's a flawed process. And like I said, I think that we need to be looking at smart business decisions. We need to be looking at data as policy drivers rather than politics.
Mike, one last question. This actually comes from Cindy Ray with the Hancock Herald. She writes, "Thank you, Mike, for your service to the people of this county. Do you have," and you knew this was going to be coming, "do you have any plans to run for office in the future?"
So Cindy, here's what I would say to you and to everyone. This has been an amazing experience for me. I've enjoyed being a member of the Senate. It will be one of the greatest honors of my life, certainly. Ray was talking about when I started my bus company when I was 22. I wish I was still 22. I just turned 37 recently, and I'm blessed that I think 37 gives me a lot of runway left in life. And I would tell you, Cindy, I don't know entirely what the future holds for me. I'm not running for office this November. I haven't picked that I'm running for office ever again. I haven't identified a place that I want to go. But what I would tell you is that I look at public service as an opportunity, not a job. I never went into this to be a politician, so to speak, to run for the next office, to run for every office. So I look forward to moving back into a role as a private citizen for a little bit. I see myself being back in the private sector for a while, but I never say never, because I think that if the right opportunity calls, I think you really need to have that motivation and that fire in your belly, that drive to go out and say that I want to serve. And really, a lot of what informed my decision about not rerunning were a couple things. First, the district that I've come to love and serve, which has been Orange and Sullivan and Delaware County, was sort of scissored right in half, right? So what it meant for me was that so many of the relationships that I've spent the last several years building were not going to be a reality. Because the process wasn't going to allow for that. So when I weighed that on the fact that, as I said, I've got 3 small kids at home, 3 kids, 6-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 2-year-old, and the opportunity to be able to spend some really important time during some really important years with my family, I said to myself, you know what? This has been a great experience. It's time right now for me to step away. So I don't know. So I have to remain non-committal either way. But I would tell you, certainly, right in the immediate, I'm not running for any office, but I think that, again, for me and for others that are listening here, if for some reason your intuition calls you, you should go look, because I was someone who was never elected to public office ever before in my life. I wasn't on a town board, a school board. I wasn't the dog catcher. I was no one. And I ran for state senate and won and have had a great time. And I think we need more people who don't have political experience, but really have a whole lot of real life experience, putting their hat in the arena, giving it a shot, because those are the voices that we need in government now more than ever. But in the meantime, stay tuned. I'll keep you posted. And I hope that certainly we get to spend a lot of time together in the next 5 months and that our paths cross again at some point.
Mike, thank you so much for spending so much time with us this morning. And I value your friendship and I value your continued support, and thank you for the work that you've done for all of us over the last nearly 2 years. And I for one am looking forward to what you're going to do yet over these next 5 months.
All right. Look, like I said, I want to thank you again for having me, and thank you and your membership. I mean, you and Lillian and your board and the team at the chamber, you really are the biggest little chamber that you could ever have in this state. Amazing the footprint and the fingerprint that you have, not only on your region, but you know, I certainly want your members to know, whether it's a partnership event that's happening way down here in the Hudson Valley, I turn around and there's Ray Pucci, you know, right down here in my hometown, talking about important economic development issues, things that might be happening here that have a huge impact on the area that you call home. I thank you for your advocacy, for being so active. And you know, the last thing I'll certainly leave with your members is just keep doing what you're doing. You know, as a legislator, I sat on your side of the screen for a decade, and I've been over here for basically 18 months. And what I would tell you is I'm soon to be back on your side of the screen again. And if I've taken one thing from being on this side, it's that being organized and being not only being organized with respect to your efforts, but having a voice right up close to elected officials who are shaping policy is so important. So Ray, you know, you talked about the importance of joining the chamber, being a member, supporting the chamber. And I urge your members and others that might be watching this at a later point, please do that, because all of you binding together create a sizable force that's so necessary, because without your voice, I don't know where policymakers would be. So please keep doing what you're doing. And in the meantime, again, if I can be helpful, please connect with Ray in the chamber, and my staff and I are here to help you with whatever you need. And I certainly, again, hope to look forward to seeing all of you, perhaps at least once more before the end of the year.
Great, Mike, thanks again. And thank you all for joining us this morning. Just two reminders. Our next breakfast is on the 19th of August. David Brower with SUNY Delhi is going to talk about engaging, motivating, inspiring Gen Z workers. And then on August 25th is our next Chamber Connects program. And we're going to be joined by a current Assembly representative, Brian Miller. So that's going to be an interesting conversation as well. Remember, with at the Delaware County Chamber of Commerce, we have many views, but one voice. And always, as Mike just said, we really are stronger together. Thanks for joining us. See you all soon. Mike, again, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.